hi to the Navia Ask Zajef. Now you will notice this is not Navia. I didn't end up getting her, so I don't have her on my account. But don't you worry, I have discussed her with many people who do have her, and I've tested her quite a bit. So let's get started. As usual for these Ask Zajefs, we're gonna start with a quick little recap of Navia's place in the meta, her pull value, and all of that. Navia is a character who very much stands separately from other characters. She's a Geo character that isn't really Geo, but mainly she presses her skill in the enemy's die. That's effectively what you're doing with her. As it turns out, her relative lack of restrictions, because while you are incentivized to play her with another Geo unit, it isn't actually necessary. You have a lot of flexibility, but it makes it so that she has relatively flexible teams as long as you're, in the same basic idea that you want to be having her do more damage, right? So you're generally going to want to play her with buffers, stuff like that. But which specific buffers you use, you have a lot of flexibility with that, which makes her, I would say, one of the better units when it comes to, you already have a strong first team, but not a strong second team, and you want to get a strong second team without having to use any of the units that you are using on your first team. There's a very good possibility that you have decent teammates for Navia. Now, does that mean that Navia is broken? No. Navia is a character who is, like I've talked about a lot in the pre-release and post-release, her damage is very front-loaded. When you just look at her overall damage output, it's good, but it's not anything all that impressive. But her ability to front-load her damage means that not only will she feel better to play, but also she overperforms compared to her quote-unquote DPS because that damage happens earlier into your rotation, which means that if it's enough to kill, you don't have to go through the rest of your rotation where your damage goes down. On top of that, a lot of that front load isn't just the fact that her skill has 2 charges and a relatively short cooldown instead of just 1 charge with a short cooldown or something like that, means that she can do the default 2 charges. But if you use the first one early enough, the cooldown of that first one can come back up before you would want to swap out. And yeah, if you use that, then obviously you now have an additional 18 seconds that you'd have to wait to get your cooldowns back. So it means that for the next rotation, you're not also going to have 3, you're going to have 2 for the next one. Right? She gets 2 skills per rotation, but she can always borrow 1 skill from the next rotation. Her first rotation, she does 3 skills and then 2, 2, 2. It also means that when you're playing against elemental shields, multi-wave stuff, very often that time that you're spending between enemies that usually is slowing down your rotations, it is still slowing down your rotation, but in Navia's case, that's not as big of a deal because that additional time you're losing, well, that's effectively the time you need to regenerate your 3rd skill. Her damage profile, the way that she outputs her damage in a very front-loaded manner and the way that she can borrow damage from her next rotation allows her to be a lot more flexible when it comes to the sort of situations where she can be good, on top of just overall being relatively strong. Now, as usual, Navia is a carry, and you're never going to really need more than 2 carries, which significantly hurts her pull value. Just like any carry. Any carry that isn't the best carry is inherently going to be not that valuable compared to most supports. However, for a carry, I'd say that her pull value is definitely among the higher ones. And yeah, I guess we can quickly cover theater shenanigans. It doesn't matter. I don't think theater shenanigans really affect characters' pull value. The reality when it comes to theater is that it is not difficult. What is difficult about it is owning enough units of each element. If there's a theater where you just literally do not own enough characters to enter it, and it's a Geo theater, then Navia would help you. Otherwise, she wouldn't. Anyways, let's get right into the questions. Is Navia R5 Sac Greatsword still recommended? If not, then what are her other free-to-play 4-star options? I mean, like I talked about in the post-release, Sac Greatsword isn't necessarily like an insane option for her, but it definitely is one of her good free-to-play options. If you don't have her signature or like a really strong 5-star stat stick and like you're free-to-play so you don't have Serpent Spine, it's definitely one of your stronger options. Does she always need a second Geo character for the Crystallize? Not necessarily. Let's say you're playing Bennett, Shengling, Farina. So you'd have around 150 damage percent. Getting 0 stacks for damage is 789.6%. This is motion value. We're gonna have damage percent and adjusted motion value, which is effectively just you multiply this times your attack times your crit, whatever, that's the damage you're gonna do. At 3, this gets doubled. And then at 6, you effectively just gain 45 damage percent, which means each crystallize between 0 and 3 increases your damage by 33%. Each crystallize between 3 and 6 increases your damage by 6%. What I'm getting at is, once you already have 3, getting more does increase your damage, but not that significantly. What really matters is that you get your first 3. Generally, she can get her first 3 from the stacks that she gains from her ult itself and the ult crystallize. It does mean that, you know, more crystallizes with another Geo character will slightly increase her skill damage, but it's not necessary if you have other things you could be doing. Is Geo MC still her best Geo teammate now that we have Chiori? Okay, so the caveat to that is, like, Geo MC was her best Geo teammate, assuming you didn't need the shielding from Zhongli. I think that in most situations, Zhongli would effectively be better. But now, I'd say Chiori's probably just straight up better. How much ER does she need if you're willing to cheat out skills? It depends on how strong your Navia is. The reality is that if you look at like Navia speedruns, you don't need any ER. Because the enemy will die within your first ult, and you'll have between 2 and 4 skills used every time, plus HP particles from fully killing a chamber, right? So in situations like that, you basically don't need any ER. If you don't have that much damage, then you're gonna need a bit more. I'd say that generally 130, 135 is like a benchmark of comfort in most situations, but yeah. How good is Navia and Xianyun plunge teams compared to others? I don't think you should ever be setting yourself up as like, okay, I want to play a Xianyun plunge team. Who do I want to play? Okay, I will play Navia. The way I'd look at it is, you want to play a Navia team? Is Xianyun a decent option? And the answer is yeah. I don't think she's necessarily the best option, but depending on the sort of stuff you're fighting, sometimes, you know, if you're fighting enemies that have a high power resistance, the good old reliable Bennett Changling isn't quite as good. So you can consider using stuff like Xianyun, yeah. Chiori C1 or Navia C1 if you want to boost your Navia Chiori team. Probably Chiori C1, just because Navia C1 isn't the best. How far behind are the other team archetypes? I assume you mean for Navia? From National, Hyper, and Plunge, like Freeze, Caesar, and Aggravate? I mean, it's behind, right? Like, you're not playing a synergistic team for Navia. You're just putting Navia in a 3-unit core. Navia is strong enough that that's still gonna probably be strong enough to clear, but it is noticeably weaker, yeah. That being said, depending on the thresholds of investments that you have, killing an enemy in a rotation and a quarter, or a rotation and 3 quarters, very often ends up being very similar clear times, especially with a front-loaded unit like Navia, which makes it so that very often, even if the team is noticeably worse against some enemies, other enemies are going to have HP thresholds that make it seem like they're a lot closer than they actually are. You know, alternatively, that also means that there are a lot of enemies where you can get away with playing those suboptimal teams. Where is Kaveh? He's gonna come on Navia's banner, trust. Is Navia's set a bait? See, that's a good question. No, and yes. We're gonna talk about resin efficiency very quickly. I have been farming pretty much randomly for the past, like, 2 months between character, like, XP, between Mora, between artifacts, talent, materials, weeklies. And the main reason for that is because, as of now, there is no quote-unquote resin-efficient way that I can farm that will increase my account's power in a reasonable amount of time. The average expected amount of resin that I would need to spend in, say, the Marie-José domain to get a significant increase to my best Marie-José set is really high. It would be very normal for me to spend a whole month in the domain without seeing a single upgrade, because I already have pretty good Marie-José artifacts. And the reality is that if you play for long enough, you will get to that point too. And once you are at that point, then what would you rather do? Spend 3 months in a domain to get 1 more substat on your Marie-José set, or spend 3 months in Navia's domain and get a set that's almost as good as your Marie-José set, but that's just for her. And honestly, the answer to that is going to depend on the person. Some people prefer just sticking to that same domain and trying to get the perfect artifacts. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's also worth noting that if you're not someone who wants to level 90 everyone, that's a lot less resources you have to get outside of your artifacts. If you're a battle pass buyer, that's a lot of resources you get without having to spend resin on it. And that lets you pretty much just spend your time in the artifact domains. because of that, you're gonna end up being in a situation where, for a lot of you guys, farming for a new set just doesn't really have that much of a downside. It's either you farm for a new set or you go back to Maréchaussée and Emblem that you've been farming for 2 years. For some of you guys, it is a big downside. You don't have that great of a Maréchaussée yet. You don't have that great of an Emblem yet. And if that's the case for you, then yeah, maybe it's not really worth it farming for a set for her. However, the fact that her set isn't really that far behind Maréchaussée even in Farina teams means that once you have a set for her, you won't have to share it with anyone else, and you'll be able to know that she always has the right artifacts, which is something that can otherwise be kind of annoying if you have a lot of characters built and they share artifacts a lot. I never know which of my characters are built. The only characters that I know are pretty much always built are Navia, because there's no other HP scaling character that I want on a Maréchaussée set. Same for Farina. If you build Navia with her signature set, that'll pretty much be the case as well. You'll know that she's built. All in all, I'd say that it boils down to how much you're gonna play her. If you're gonna play her a lot, I would recommend going for her signature set. If you're not gonna play her a lot, then maybe spending a couple months in a domain just to get a set for her isn't really worth it for you. It's gonna be a decision you have to make for yourself. How does Navia compare to other front-loaded characters like Arlecchino? Outside of Bennett, which they both kind of want to use, Arlecchino generally uses different teammates. I do think that Arlecchino would tend to overall be slightly better, but not that significantly. And the way that Arlecchino front-loads her damage is very different from Navia. I think overall she is stronger, but her ability to front-load her damage isn't as significant as Navia's, and she can't borrow damage from her next rotation. So Navia is stronger on the first rotation than she is on future rotations, because she can always borrow a skill from her next rotation and effectively start with 3 skills on first rotation and then 2 skills for all the following rotations. Arlecchino is literally the other way around. She gets stronger on the second rotation because you have leftover Bond of Life from the first rotation. I'd say that overall, Arlecchino's power level is higher than Navia, but in practice, because very often enemies die in the first or at least first 2 rotations, it makes it so that the difference in power is very small in practice most of the time. When you're doing stuff that requires more rotations, right? If we look back at the Regis Vine event with the really tanky bosses, Arlecchino is going to outperform Navia, because that's a situation where you actually start going past the first and maybe even second rotation reliably, because you need a lot more damage. But that's not the case in Abyss. And so first rotation starts, and you have your Bond of Life in the middle of the 9. Generally, the amount of time-ish that you're gonna spend on her. And then second rotation starts. You get this Bond of Life, and you have a pretty decent amount of additional Bond of Life, right? So like, while they're both characters that front load their damage, the way they interact with multi-rotation, right? The way they interact with really tanky enemies that survive the first rotation is different. How versus hold E and when to use E each. The purpose of hold E is, well, 1, you can aim it, which is nice for AoE, and 2, it sucks in nearby crystallizes. So if you're already at 6 stacks, holding E will suck in nearby crystallizes, which you could otherwise use on your next E. So it's not good. You want to use your tap so that you can then follow it up pretty much immediately with a hold that is then going to suck those in, and you're not going to be wasting the shells, basically. But it's really not that big of a deal, honestly. You're better off mostly focusing on using hold when you need to aim it, and that's pretty much it. I think that pretty much covers the main stuff. So, thank you all for dropping by. I hope you learned a thing or two as usual. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube. French dub Navia? Pro, actually. Fédération! Attaque frontale! Bien le bonjour! Yeah! What do you mean the attack is continuons de nous battre?